So as I was saying, I've done. I had an interview with WGBY last month or the month before, and it was on this topic. And I had done so much research on it that I really decided to kind of put it into a canned presentation and offer it up to different organizations that were interested, like our club. Because this conflict, certainly has a lot of significance as far as the Ukraine goes, but it also has a lot of importance to the European Union and also to the United States, and I try to cover that as far as the presentation goes. I'd like to start off by sort of orienting everybody as to where we're talking about, or what we're talking about. This is Europe, as you know. When you talk about Europe, you have Western Europe, which is kind of the hub of Europe. Most of Europe kind of funnels around Western Europe. This is the British Isles. You got the Mediterranean countries like Spain, Italy, and Greece. You got the Nordic or Northern European countries like the Scandinavian countries. And then finally you have Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, as you know, was annexed by Russia at the end of World War II. It became known as the Warsaw Pact countries, part of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Eastern Europe reunited with Europe. And along with Eastern Europe, 6 Soviet republics likewise joined as well. And that included the countries of Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Now, recognizing the fact that, let me go to the next chart. This is probably a better chart that shows the breakup of Eastern Europe today. This red line here represents what Eastern Europe looked like before or at the end of World War II. It's generally called Old Eastern Europe. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and Eastern Europe reunited with Europe, the Soviet Union broke up into 15 republics, and 6 of those republics became part of what we know today as the new Eastern Europe. Again, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia up in the north. Our focus right here is on Ukraine, territorially the largest country in Europe today, with a population of about 45 million people. Of that, about 8 million are of Russian, descent. I'll talk about it in the presentation, but I wanted to kind of orient you, if you've been following the news, that in the November timeframe of last year, the Russians who had seized control of Crimea in 2014 ended up seizing 3 Ukrainian vessels in the Strait of Kerch right here. It really became an international incident. There was really a lot of concern that would end up in open warfare between the Ukraine and Russia. Could very well draw in Eastern Europe in terms of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and possibly even the United States as well. And so this was really a major incident just before Christmas of last year. So let's talk about really what's going on. I think the first thing that everybody has to understand when you talk about Russia today, and when I talk about Russia, I'm really referring to what their real name is, called the Russian Federation, but they use their own name of Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia developed this concept known as this near abroad concept, even though it broke up into 15 republics who went their separate ways, declaring their independence. As I said, some of them went to Eastern Europe. Others became what we now know today as Central Asia. And under this near abroad concept, Russia took the approach that, geez, all these 14 republics, other 14 republics, because of their proximity to Russia, they can impact not only the economic, but the national security of the country. And Russia would not stand by and let that happen. If they felt that there was a reason to intervene, then they would not hesitate. For example, they did that with Georgia. The northern part of Georgia you have what's referred to as North Ossetia, and the bottom part of Russia you've got South Ossetia, very, very large minority in North Ossetia, and there was a lot of claims that the Georgian government was very, very oppressive to these Russians. And what happened? Russia ended up intervening in Georgia. So under this near broad concept, they won't hesitate to intervene if they think that is in their best interest. And right now, as far as the Ukraine goes, again, one of the former republics, they take the position that because of its strategic location on the border of Russia, it really does present, a threat to their national interest and national security. So under this near broad concept, it doesn't hesitate to intervene in any of the other 14 republics if they feel that it's in the country's best interest. Now, some will say, gee, that doesn't seem very, very fair. You got to recognize the independence of other countries. We always have to be very, very careful of it because, in a way, we have our own near-abroad concept here in the Western Hemisphere. The United States has what's known as the Monroe Document, or doctrine, that went into effect, I think, in the 1800s time frame. And we use that, for example, to intervene in the the Cuban crisis back in the 1960s. There's also indication that we may very well use it as far as the current situation going on in Venezuela. The question you should then have now is, why is Ukraine so important to Russia? And I tried to indicate what these are. Like I said, it has a very, very large border with Russia. Again, the largest country in Europe. It has a lot of military importance to Russia as well, as far as the Crimea Peninsula goes. The Crimea Peninsula really controls access to the Sea of Azov and also to the Black Sea. Matter of fact, on the Crimea Peninsula, you also find that that's where the Soviets, with the permission of the Ukraine, has housed its Black Sea naval fleet. The security threat, there's also a security threat to Russia, and that currently the Ukraine is part of Europe, not part of the former Soviet Union. And they have been trying to align over the last 5 to 10 years with the European Union, and has also indicated an interest in joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. From Russia's perspective, that is totally an unacceptable situation. They don't want the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on its back door. Basically, a border that's very, 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 very long. And so if they can keep the Ukraine more aligned with Russia and not Europe, it's to their advantage. And what's complicated it even more is that Ukraine, when they broke away from the Soviet Union, really took the position that they wanted to go their own way. They wanted to more align itself with Europe. And the Soviet Union really has not supported that. They see the Ukraine and the other 13 republics as still sort of part of the former Soviet Union. Kind of similar the situation that we have in China as far as Taiwan goes. Taiwan broke away at the end of World War II when they were forced out of China. They went to the island of Formosa, which you now know today is Taiwan. They wanted to declare their independence. China has always taken the position that Taiwan is a renegade province. If in fact they ever try to do that, they will take the necessary force to keep that from happening. Russia is sort of taking the same type of position with the Ukraine. Very, very large country, well endowed with natural resources, And so they would prefer to see, for example, an economic alliance, not with the European Union, but rather with what's known as the Commonwealth of Independent States, which today, just recently, has been renamed to the Eurasia Union. What are the events that led to the to the current conflict that we have between the UK and Russia? It really goes all the way back to 2004 timeframe during the Orange Revolution. To understand Ukraine today, I think you need to understand that there's a part of the country, relatively small population in relation to the total country, basically the Russian minorities, that really would like to maintain their ties with the Russian Federation. You've got the rest of the country that really, over time, would like to realign itself with Europe, the European Union, and eventually even the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so the two political fractions within the country have really been jockeying for power within the country. In 2004, in the November 2004 election, there were two candidates that were running, Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych. Sure. And Yushchenko really aligned with those that wanted to go more towards Europe. And then you had Viktor Yanukovych, who really was more closely aligned with Russia, wanted to reestablish the ties. When the elections were held in November of 2004, indications were that there was fraud going on in the elections. Became a real public, incident. There was rioting, which eventually became known as the Orange Revolution. The party that supposedly was responsible for the fraudulent voting was Viktor Yanukovych. With the end results, there was a lot of crises in the area. The Supreme Court, the Ukrainian Supreme Court stepped in, declared the elections as being fraudulent, nulled and void them, held new elections in December of 2004, and subsequently Yushchenko ended up winning. And that kind of put to rest for a while, the turmoil that was going on in the country. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych eventually was able to win the presidency. And he started to move the country away from its alignment with Europe to much stronger ties with the Soviet Union. Really came to a head in 2013, where there was an economic agreement that was being negotiated between the Ukraine and the European Union. And President Yanukovych was supposed to sign it, and then in late November 2013 decided he wasn't going to sign it. He thought that he could get a better deal for the country through economic ties with Russia. That led to the Ukraine revolt that started in February 2014. Because the Ukrainian people did not want to move back to Russia control. They wanted to have stronger ties with the European Union. They ousted the president, Yanukovych, at the time. He fled to the southeastern part of the country, known as the Donbass region. And meanwhile, they held new elections. Subsequently, in the late 2014 timeframe, they signed that economic association with the European Union. President Yanukovych wasn't happy, obviously, with the status quo being ousted out of office, and so he reached out to Putin, President Putin of Russia, in March 1st of 2014, saying, "Geez, I've been ousted out of power. I really would prefer the Ukraine aligning with you rather than the European Union. Will you give us a helping hand? Will you help put me back into power?" And obviously, Putin said yes. He went to the Russian parliament, got approval to intervene. And because they had a strong military presence in Crimea, because they had their naval force there, and at the same time a very large ground force as well, that's where they ended up initially, entering the country and covertly, taking control of the Crimea Peninsula. The Crimea Peninsula is predominantly, has a very, very large Russian population. So when they had a referendum to decide whether or not in 2014 they were going to stay with the Ukraine or request to be annexed by Russia, all indications are, even though the elections may have been fraudulent, the referendum came out saying that they wanted to move in the direction of Russia. And obviously Russia did not hesitate to annex them. I think it was in March 2014. At the exact same time that this was going on, which provided Russia the foothold in the Ukraine, you also had President Yanukovych, who was from the Donbass area, gaining support there as well, because it's predominantly a very large Russian minority in that part of the country. And so civil uprising broke out there as well, and that's the conflict that you've been hearing about since March 2014. Where you've got in the region, in the city of Donetsk, in the city of Luhansk, which is all in the Donbass area, an uprising of people were saying they want their independence from the Ukraine. And meanwhile, covertly, the Russian Federation is providing military assistance to the country. To this group. Even though they've been denying it, aerial coverage, intelligence is indicating that Russia is intimately involved in this internal conflict that's going on. It's gotten very, very violent. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced since 2014. There's been over 10,000 civilians that have been killed. And so, obviously, it's an international concern. There was a treaty initiative in February 2015, the Minsk Peace Treaty, that involved Belarus, France, Germany, Russia, and the Ukraine, which hopefully was going to bring peace into the area. But over the years, over and over, both sides seem to have broken the peace, and so the conflict continues. And then it hit, the conflict was going on, the European Union, the United States were putting economic sanctions on Russia to kind of back them away, hoping that the Russians backed out of the Donbass region. Then eventually the Ukrainian government would be able to move in and pacify the area. And then it hit another hurdle in the November time frame. When the Ukraine took over the Crimea Peninsula, it really gave them control of the Sea of Azov, to include the Strait of Kerch, which is the passage between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Ukraine needs the Sea of Azov to be able to ship out its exports in the area: steel, wheat, other type products. And so Russia, now in control of Crimea, wanted to have, more direct control, so they built a bridge between Russia in Crimea, which gave them firm control over Crimea, but also firm control over the Strait of Kerch, which, according to an accord reached between Ukraine and Russia in 2003, was really considered both countries had equal share, or equal rights to be able to pass through the strait in and out of the Sea of Azov into the Black Sea. Russia, now seeing that they had control of Crimea, they also had control on the Russian side as well, decided that they were going to start controlling, access to the region. And in November, 3 Ukraine vessels were entering the strait, and the Russians decided to halt them because they did not ask permission. And if you followed the news at all, 24 sailors, were captured, were seized. Some of them were hurt. They're still, under captivity by the Russians. They won't release them. The international community has said that this is unlawful. Europe, Germany, France have tried to negotiate with the Russians to release these sailors, and it just hasn't happened. When this incident took place, the president of Ukraine, President Poroshenko, was really fearful that the Russians had a much broader intention, that they really wanted to launch a major military campaign into Ukraine in the Donbass area, which they already had control of through the local uprising that were taking place there. And so, you see this buildup between the Russians and the Ukraine. You can't help but ask yourself, what is Russia trying to achieve? Why did Russia seize the vessels? First of all, they wanted to reinforce the fact that they had control over Crimea. They now saw it as a Russian territory, no longer a Ukrainian territory. They wanted to increase economic pressure on Ukraine, eventually hoping them to bring them to their knees and possibly force Ukraine to turn towards Russia rather than Europe for support. It also raises the question that if you can control the Strait of Kerch, you also control the Sea of Azov, and so that puts further pressure on Ukraine because they need their ports in the Sea of Azov in order to be able to support their economy. And because of this crisis, the seizing of the vessels and the fear that there might be a Russian invasion, the Ukraine president on, I think it was November 24th, November 26th, put martial law in effect in the country for a total of 30 days to give them an opportunity to reconstitute themselves, reach out to the United States and to Europe for military support if, in fact, Russia ended up making an invasion. And that's currently where it stands right now. Everybody sort of jockeying around to get the best possible position. And so the questions that you got to ask yourself is, what should NATO have done in the beginning? When the Russians, when this first broke out in 2014, Russia, for the most part, was behind it, didn't openly acknowledge it, but all the intelligence indicated that they were. Instead of being more proactive, NATO basically did nothing, other than saying you shouldn't do that and we're going to impose an economic sanction. The argument is, could NATO have done something? People would say no, because Ukraine was not a member of NATO. But if you look at what what NATO has done over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, you don't have to be a member of NATO to get support. NATO lent support to Bosnia, to Kosovo. As you know, we provided an air umbrella over Libya, supporting the rebels that eventually led to the downfall of the Gaddafi regime. And NATO likewise provides support to the U.S. in the Afghan, war. These are all countries that have no relationship at all in NATO. So an argument could have been made that in the defense of Europe, that we could have provided support, to the Ukraine. My experience when I was in the military and dealing with the Russians, if you don't stand firm with them, they end up taking advantage of the situation a little bit at a time, seeing how far you allow them to go. And we allow them to get into the country through the back door. We could also deploy, NATO could also deploy NATO vessels to the Sea as Azov. That raises an issue because it's not considered international waters. It's actually considered private inland lake under the control of both the Ukraine and Russia. We could step up economic sanctions along with the U.S., which so far has not proven to be very successful because the Russians are still there. We could provide short-range based anti-shipping missiles to help protect the Ukrainian Navy in the Sea of Azov because they are no match currently for the Russian fleet. And the big concern is the reason why NATO really hasn't done as much as they possibly could because they are currently very, very heavily reliant on Russia for natural gas and oil. And they don't have an alternative right now, and so consequently, in a sense, Russia has them over a barrel and recognizes that fact. What can the United States do? Well, certainly we can continue to increase the economic sanctions on Russia. We can go to the UN, try to get the UN to impose a UN resolution that, first of all, the annexation of Crimea was illegal, that the interdiction of the vessels in the Strait of Kerch was illegal. But the problem you run into is that in the United Nations, Russia is part of the Security Council, is one of the 5 countries that have a veto power. So anything you try to get through the United Nations, through the Security Council, will never pass because the Russians will not allow it to do it, allow it to happen. We can increase military support, which we have been doing. We have provided them weapons, ammunition, communications. We've provided them Javelin anti-tank missile systems in the event that the Russians did invade with tanks. We've increased air exercises with the Ukrainian Air Force to eventually provide possibly an air umbrella in the countries, along the lines of what we did in Libya. And that leads to the last bullet: provide an air umbrella over Ukraine. We would certainly have the consent of the government, and that might be enough deterrence, to have the Russians pull back. Last thing I want to talk about is, what is Russia after? What does Russia want out of all of this? And this is really a very interesting part of the discussion. President Putin is watching. Inaction by the United States and Europe will only embolden Putin to intensify his actions in Ukraine. They may do it covertly, through the rebels in northeastern Ukraine, but as they continue to put economic pressure on the Ukrainian government, especially if they cut off exporting through the Strait of Kerch, that could put the economic situation of the country at risk and open the door for Russia, especially since there is relatively a large-sized Russian minority in the country. President Putin wants Ukraine to realign itself with Russia. And it used to be called the Commonwealth of Independent States. They now call it the Eurasian Union, using the Crimea annexation, the Donbass uprising, and the Strait of Kerch to weaken the current president. Matter of fact, he is scheduled to have a new election coming up in March of this year. And furthermore, if you stand back, again, what is Russia really after? Russia is testing the water. They are really saying, how far will the rest of the world allow them to resume that position that they had about 40 years ago during the Cold War period. We already see that in the actions that they've taken in Syria. He has already done so with the other Russian republics, like Georgia that I just mentioned. It has intervened in Azerbaijan, claiming that Azerbaijan is gaining access to oil fields that Russia feels is under its control. We've seen it in Moldova, as well. And the next bullet is violating, is taking other initiatives, like it's violating the IMF treaty, and that is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, which is supposed to outlaw ground surface nuclear weapons that have a capability or a range capability of 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers. And all indications are they are in fact testing a ground type weapon of that capability, which is in violation of the IMF treaty. That's why the current Trump administration is saying that they are seriously considering, removing itself from the treaty because the Russians aren't living up to it. And so the obvious next question is, what is Putin up to next? And if you think about it, possibilities exist even in our backyard. Just recently, as you know, the situation in Venezuela has not been very good. The Russians have been talking to the Venezuelan President Maduro, President Maduro has made a trip to Russia asking economic support, which he's received. As you know, Venezuela is in dire economic strife situation right now. And just recently, in late December, 2 Soviet nuclear bombers had a short layover in Venezuela. And strong indications are that there may be in the backroom negotiations going on to establish some type of an air-based operation in Venezuela. And that gets us back to the situation that we had in Cuba, back in the 1960s time frame. So this conflict, even though it's in Europe and it involves the Ukraine, has far-reaching consequences not only for Europe and NATO and our involvement in NATO, but also an impact here in the United States, at least the Western Hemisphere, and also a global impact as well, because you hate to think about going back to the Cold War day period, when the Soviet Union existed. And so it's an area that we should keep very, very close, eyes on, especially in terms of what is Putin going to do next, President Putin going to do next, to push that envelope as to how far the rest of the world, especially the United States, will let them go. If we let them get too far, like I said, we'll go back to the Cold War days. Any questions?
Just one.
Yeah.
We listened to President Trump seeming to be pleased with Putin and friendly. Do you think that he truly is, or is that just keep your enemy close so you know what he's up to?
I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
I really do think that deep down he recognizes the threat that Putin, that Russia represents today. Right. If you look at the actions that the United States has taken since he's been in office, we certainly can't say that we have been very supportive of the things that they do, especially in terms of the economic sanctions. But he's the type of negotiator that likes to keep his enemies close. If you can't talk to them, you isolate yourself from them, then the situation doesn't get better, it gets worse. I think he's using that exact same approach as far as North Korea goes. We have been concerned about North Korea going all the way back to the 1990s. But we've never really sat down and really talked to the North Korean leader. We didn't do it in the past. It's only been with the Trump administration that we at least got them sitting down talking at the table. And as long as you got them sitting down talking at the table, and you're aware of the situation, you would hope that in the end, we're going to come out ahead. And I think that's what he's hoping for. Peter?
In 2012, in a presidential debate, Mitt Romney was mocked.
Oh yeah.
For saying that Russia is a threat. And was his intelligence better than the then president's?
Well, obviously so, because Obama did not, in fact, consider Russia a threat. And if you remember, he was caught off mic with the Russian president, where he says, well, once I get elected into my second term, I'll be in a better position to do more with your country, which gives the impression that there was some type of potential collusion between the two countries. Trump is hard to take because of the way that he manages himself, but I think it's important to never lose sight of the fact that he's a negotiator. And as a negotiator, you recognize the fact that in business, you always go high. You always ask the crazy thing. You know you're not going to get it, but it gives you all that area between the high and the low to negotiate. And I think a lot of times he ends up saying something to stir the pot, and then he'd sort of let things unfold, and he finally sees what is the right direction to go. I think he's doing that in Syria. In the last month he says, we're going to pull out, indications are we're going to pull out right away. And everybody said, no, we can't do that. People started talking together. We now recognize the fact that we still need to move out, but it needs to be a more planned, withdrawal to give us enough time to make sure, one, that ISIS is completely destroyed, which I don't think will ever happen. I don't think they'll ever destroy ISIS totally. we accomplished what we did set out to do in Syria, that is destroy the caliphate. The caliphate is destroyed, not only in Syria and also in Iraq, which created that territorial control that ISIS had that Al-Qaeda never had. And so ISIS has kind of been put in the same category as Al-Qaeda. Even after everything that we've done in Afghanistan, we still have not eliminated Al-Qaeda as an organization, and I don't think you ever will. Same thing with ISIS. So it probably is time for the United States to pull out. Maybe we should leave some forces behind to protect the Kurds up in the north. But the longer we linger around, and once that war comes together, you can rest assured that Syria and the rest of the world is going to look to the United States to help rebuild Syria. And I hate to see us go through with Syria what we went through with Iraq, because you're talking about tens and tens of billions of dollars to reconstruct that country. We can't be the defenders for the whole world. I mean, people can say what you want about NATO. We provide most of the logistical support to NATO. We pay for roughly 20 to 25% of their total funding, even though there's a standing agreement that each of the countries is supposed to provide up to 2% of their GDP. And of the 28 countries that are in NATO today, I think there's only 5 that ends up doing that. So who's footing the bill? We are. And we're not only doing it in terms of funds, we're doing it in terms of manpower. Tens of thousands of Americans, in Europe, providing, for the defense of Europe at a time when they're not willing to pay their fair share. So is he wrong in saying, yes, we will continue to provide the support, but geez, you got to pay your fair share? And, and I think he's doing the exact same thing as far as the United Nations go. We provide, I think, around 20% of the total UN bill. And there's actually 2 bills. People don't realize it. You have sort of the administrative bill of the United Nations, which is about $3 to $4 billion, I believe. And then you have their peacekeeping operations, which is a separate bill, which is another $7 to $9 billion. So the expense of the United Nations on an annual basis is probably $10 to $13 billion, and we're paying 25%, roughly 25% of that. And you can't lose sight of the fact that we're a country that now has a national debt that has gone over $21 trillion. It's larger than our gross domestic product each year, which I think right now is probably around $18 to $19 trillion. And when your debt gets that high, you have serious financial difficulties ahead of you. And you can't continue, to stick your head in the ground and hope that it goes away. So you have to start looking, how do I cut back? Do you cut back in domestic programs first, or do you cut back on your international programs first and then come home and look at your national programs? Any other questions?
Good job.
Well, I thank everybody for staying over. I think it is an important topic, and in this short time I tried to put it into perspective. Keep your eye on what's going on as far as Russia goes. Not so much in the Ukraine, but internationally. I think they're a far greater threat than China. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.